What's up everybody, Michael Ezerecki here, and today we're talking about the Insta360 One R. Woo! Let's get into it. So I want to start this whole thing out by saying that this review has been really hard for me. And the reason for that is because in reality, I pretty much almost always generally kind of hate action cameras. And it's kind of like a love-hate thing with me because I always feel like I need an action camera. And it's one of those things that, you know, it's a lifesaver when you can stick it into an impossibly small spot for any other camera. But at the same time, I always feel like I'm a little bit disappointed in the footage that I get out of it. And you know, I don't use it as much as I originally intended to when I buy them because I have other better cameras at my disposal. So action cameras and it's a love-hate thing. I kind of love them and I kind of hate them. And generally speaking, that's about as good as it gets for an action camera with me. That being said, the Insta360 One R is by far the most interesting and unique action camera I have ever seen. So as I'm sure most of you know by now, the main thing that sets this camera apart from other action cameras in this segment is the fact that it breaks apart in this modular way where you have the brain, the battery, and then multiple different lens modules that you can install onto this camera to get different types of looks and different kind of functionality in different kinds of situations, which is really pretty cool for an action camera. That was really the main thing that made me want to try this guy out. Just to give you guys some reference, I'm not usually all that amped on action cameras. The last action camera prior to this that I purchased for myself was this guy, which is the Hero 5 Black from GoPro. And to be honest, I've gotten about as much use as I think I've needed to out of this camera. I still use it occasionally. It gives me an okay image. I'm not going to get super excited about it, but there are some things you can do to make this image better. But yeah, we're not talking about the GoPro. We're talking about the Insta360. So real quick, let's just touch on the specs for the Insta360 because this is an interesting camera. The specs change with the different modules that you put on the camera. So with this camera system, you're not just stuck with one spec set. You can change what it's capable of based on the lens mod that you have installed on the camera at that time. Let's start with the 360 mod since 360 footage is really what Insta360 is known for. The 360 mod is capable of allowing you to shoot 360 footage in up to 5.7K at 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second, which is the way that I tend to use it the most often. Now you can bump down the resolution to get a higher frame rate at 3K at up to 100 frames a second, but keep in mind that since this is 360 footage, that 5.7K or 3K respectively is wrapping that full sphere of 360 degrees. So what seems like very high resolution footage is actually being stretched out to its max to incorporate that entire 360 degree sphere. So moving on to the 4K mod, the lens is a 16 millimeter equivalent, a little bit over 16, it's like 16.3 millimeters, and provides a pretty impressive 4K image at up to 60 frames a second. It can also shoot 2.7K at up to 100 frames a second and full HD at up to 200 frames a second. So if you do happen to be looking for an action camera with good slow motion capabilities, the One R does have you covered pretty nicely there as well. One of the things I really like about the Insta360 One R is the fact that it's an action camera that has multiple picture profiles. You're capable of shooting in HDR mode and even log profiles with both of the mods that I currently have, which will give you a little bit more flexibility in post. Now, it is still a small sensor and an 8-bit image, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to push and pull that image too much in post, but it does offer those different things, which does allow you to get a little bit more creative with your image after the fact. Now, Insta360 does offer a third mod, which is a 1-inch sensor mod. That mod's pretty impressive as well, with a 1-inch sensor that can shoot up to 5.3K at 30 frames a second, or Ultra HD at up to 60 frames a second. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that mod to test it out. I don't have it yet though, so don't expect to see any footage in this video. Now, this camera records at a respectable bitrate for an action camera of 100 megabits per second, and also records in H.264 or H.265 wrapped in a proprietary file type from Insta360, which you'll have to unpack and re-encode in post in their proprietary software. If you're a Premiere Pro user, they do have a direct plugin for their Insta360 Studio that works perfectly with Premiere. I tend to do most of my editing in DaVinci Resolve 16, so I use the Insta360 Studio software as a standalone, and that's no big issue for me. It is one extra step, so I have to kind of pre-plan for that, but aside from that, it really doesn't add that big of a hiccup to my workflow. So basically, to simplify the rest of the review, I'm just going to tell you the things that I like the best about the camera and the things that I like the least about the camera, and you can take from that what you will. And as with any review, I recommend that you don't just take my word for it, but go out and do more research before you choose to buy this or any other piece of equipment, because everybody's use case is different. So moving right into that, the things that I like the best about the Insta360 One R are as follows. Number one, the 360 mode. That is way more convenient than I was expecting it to be. Especially as a YouTuber, being able to use a 360 camera to kind of film yourself doing things with no additional shooter is pretty fun. It's pretty cool to be able to just sort of attach that selfie stick with the 360 camera on top of your other camera and get interesting perspective shots of myself shooting, or place it on the ground on a small tripod and be able to kind of basically just reframe the shot however I want as I go on with my shoot. That feature alone has made this camera well worth the price of admission just because of the 360. And to be honest, I hate to say it, but this camera has kind of managed to make me a believer when it comes to 360 video. Because truthfully, I can't believe how much I love that 360 footage. It's so much fun to mess around with. The second thing I really like about this camera, especially with the 4K mod, is the image quality. I'm really impressed with how nice the image is coming off of this camera. I would not have thought that it would have looked this good, but it really is a nice action camera 4K image. Now I'm really excited to be able to get my hands on the 1-inch sensor mod and see how good that image can be, but until I get my hands on it, you'll have to wait for my feedback on that. I'll do an update video at some point. And tying right in with that image quality thing is number 3, which is the log profile. I actually found the colors very nice after grading it. It seems like a pretty decent little log profile. It's not too crazy desaturated, so you don't have to really tug and pull at that image file that much. But it does give you just a tiny bit more dynamic range, which I think adds to the quality of the image. So lastly, another real big one for me is the in-camera flow state stabilization. Oh my God. Insta360 has really figured out how to do some impressive stabilization work within that little camera body. Especially in the 360 mod, I'm so impressed with how smooth this footage actually is while walking around with this thing on a selfie stick. The footage is like absolute glass smooth, and it's amazing what they're able to do with it. So moving on to a couple of little negative things about the camera, and they're kind of minor, but depending on who you are and how you would use this camera, it might be a little bit of a deal breaker. First negative in my mind is the audio quality. It is not good coming out of this camera. So if you're looking to use this camera as like a primary vlogging camera, I would highly recommend like picking up a Zoom F1 or some kind of other self-contained separate audio recorder that you can wear and not necessarily have to depend on the audio on the camera for your primary audio source. The only thing I could see myself using it for is just simply reference audio to tie in another recorder. From what I've seen online, even using their microphone adapter, which also of course compromises the camera's waterproofing, so that kind of takes a little bit away from that as well, but that mic adapter doesn't really improve the sound quality all that much. So if you're going to depend on an action camera for audio and video, maybe don't go with this camera. If you want to use this camera for vlogging or anything like that, I would highly recommend a self-contained lav recorder of some kind. And then really the only other negative that I personally have found so far, and this might just be me, but the camera's modularity does make me kind of baby it a little bit. It concerns me about durability. It concerns me with the waterproofing. I know a lot of people have done tests on it to make sure that it did actually perform okay with waterproofing. But to me, a camera that I can just take apart like this seems like it would get damaged and water into the cracks and things like that. And so yeah, I do have a little concern with it from the standpoint of durability. A little bit of concern from the standpoint of longevity, and certainly it scares me to think about the possibility of dropping this. And this is an action camera, so that actually could be kind of a big problem. Action cameras are designed to be beat to hell. So, I've dropped my GoPro or had my GoPro get run into by stuff or had it mounted on the fork of my mountain bike and not really worried about it at all. And I have to be honest, I feel like I wouldn't be quite as comfortable doing that with this camera, just because of the fact that it comes apart. So for me, that might be a little bit of a durability problem. And who knows, only time will tell. I will put this thing through the ringer and probably beat it to death, and we'll see if it survives. So really, to wrap this thing up, I gotta say I absolutely love this little camera. I'm so impressed by the innovation that Insta360 put into this. In my opinion, it is a very serious competitor for what GoPro has been putting out for the past several years. And I have not compared the 4K footage to that of the GoPro Hero 8. I'm kind of curious to see how they compare image quality wise. So yeah, maybe let me know in the comments if you guys are interested in seeing an image quality shootout between the Insta360 One R and a couple of different GoPro models that I can get my hands on. And maybe we can kind of do, a side-by-side shootout and see what kind of image quality we get out of all of them now. Maybe things are better than they were back when I bought my Hero 5 Black. As for who I think this camera is best for, I would say anybody who's into kind of action sports type of stuff, YouTubers who are interested in being able to kind of get another angle of themselves doing something without asking a friend to come out and film them, or maybe it's an on-the-spot kind of thing. If you're just trying to find a way to get some different angles, these are really great little cameras. It's just like, putting an action camera up in a corner, but you can get these in like crazy impossible little corners and then even pan the shot after the fact, which is really cool. And then anybody who's looking for an action camera that gives them an enormous amount of flexibility, it's not quite SLR or mirrorless flexibility when it comes to lenses, but there are a lot more options with this than there are with any other action camera that I've personally seen. Unless you do one of those crazy mods with your GoPro that's like, I think it's called like a jawbone or something like that, and they rebuild that GoPro into like an interchangeable lens mount, which seems pretty cool, but maybe I'll try that with my old GoPro if we'll move on. So yeah, as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing while you're at it. And yeah, aside from that, hit me up in the comments and let me know if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos. And yeah, other than that, I will see you guys next week. Later.